So today I wanted to do a brief video to talk a little bit about some really substantive information I learned from working with an organization downtown called BIG, Brain Injury Group, head injuries, brain injuries, concussions. We were just talking, Carlene and I, about some fascinating new research that's happened in regards to head injury. And I suppose we've all heard in the big media, there's been a lot of talk about head injuries and concussions among boys, disproportionately boys who are doing sports like hockey and a lot of those high contact sports. We've come to realize that some of these games that we've thought of as wholesome and exciting and that's so great, and boys are developing their muscles and their team skills and their self-esteem, camaraderie, and lots of potentially very, very good things. We've also realized that in some of these sports, boys can get head injuries, they can get concussions that later on cause them to have learning disabilities that can cause them, and this is one of the subtle things that I think we really need to take note of, it can also cause people to have poor impulse control. If you've had concussions or head injuries and it hasn't been noticed or diagnosed, this is one of the things that you can have, learning disabilities and poor impulse control, which can create all kinds of other subsequent troubles for families. So I wanted to reflect on what I learned from, I'll back up a little bit, and I don't want to get too much into the biology, but all humans have a brain. There it is, at the top of our body. There's our brain. Now the brain, of course, is an incredibly delicate organism, and so when I go further with this conversation, the brain itself could be injured from a concussion. It could be injured from a stroke. So if somebody's had the blood stop at some part of the brain, or an aneurysm, sometimes with elderly people, for example, we imagine, a stroke is a big thing. You have like one stroke and your whole life has changed. But for some elderly people, you can have, I guess they would be called mini strokes, where some part of the brain has been oxygen deprived for not as it is in a commercial or in a movie, but the person has something happen, and incrementally over a year, let's say, they could have 3 or 4 of these episodes that in each individual case may not have been noticed by their family members or by their doctor. And it can mean that the person loses certain abilities to remember what's going on around them as effectively as they used to, or are less able to remember, for example, to take their medications or to show up for appointments or stuff like that. So also, people who do a lot of drugs and alcohol can end up with injuries to their brain. Of course, obvious, if people are sniffing glue, or we saw there was one isolated community where some of the teenagers were, I think it was called huffing, they were using different kinds of toxins, and their brains were being diminished or harmed because of this. So here's what I want you to take for today. When we're dealing with families, you want to reflect, as we've said in all the other videos, you want to reflect on the intersectionality of everybody's identity pegs. You want to look at the trajectory of everybody's life that brought them to this specific moment. So let's say mom's whole life story, dad's whole life story, grandma and grandpa on both sides, their whole life story. Ponder how intergenerational trauma, deficits, resources, how all of that is playing out and influencing this one moment. Using a structural social work analysis, you're reflecting on all the things of, did everybody in this family have good access to education, to nutrition, to adequate housing, to all the things that would make them, each person, be the best they could be. Brain injury is one of those situations or stories, let's say, where it goes underdiagnosed. People who've been involved with sports, people who've been involved with violence, people who've been in a car accident or a boating accident. All of those various things could cause the brain to respond differently. Sometimes if it's been a subtle injury or a single episode injury, it can mean that a person is really struggling and no one is understanding what might be causing that poor impulse control. They may not know what has happened. So I had the great privilege to be pulled into some art therapy and group work and individual work from Davina Banner, who's a nurse in our university nursing program. She's a nurse scholar, and she invited me to be involved with some projects being forwarded by Brain Injury Group downtown. Amazing organization. They do a lot of good work on nickels and dimes and 3/4 and a piece of string and some hope. And so I had the benefit of learning from this one woman. That was my first contact. So this woman, who had been very involved in all kinds of things, was very active, very smart, had a network of people around her that she was caring for and doing a lot of good things for. And one day she woke up and her brain was hurting. It turns out she'd had a stroke, and because she had been perceived as strong and competent and effective, all these people around her still expected her to fulfill that role and continue with her substantive, robust activities, because she was the caregiver for the people around her. All of a sudden, she was needing care to be given to her. She was needing people to protect her. We did some art therapy sessions together over a few months. We did that in the art room on campus. And she taught me some really profound lessons that I'm trying to distill for the purposes of family counseling. One, let us all be on alert for all of those things I've just listed, where the brain could have been changed without everybody being fully aware of it. So let's say you have a teenage boy who is being more impulsive and who is suddenly more angry about certain things. You might want to ask, has he been in high contact sports? Maybe something has happened that has changed his personality. Also ask yourself, if you're working with a woman who's been in violent relationships, has she taken a blow to the head somewhere along the way and had a concussion and didn't get diagnosed, and maybe subsequent to that has been working with some damage? It's kind of like, let's say if you had a car that had been in an accident and the starter isn't working, the muffler isn't working, the brakes are kind of iffy, but the person doesn't know that and they just keep driving. They just keep driving. And they're in a risky situation for a bad thing happening. Brain injuries are like that sometimes. People aren't fully aware of what has happened. Like, they may know, oh yeah, I fell down the stairs, but they may not be fully aware of all the consequences of a concussion and how it may be slowing down their thinking. It may give them a foggy feeling. It may be encouraging them to feel more depressed, because a brain injury can do that too. Depending where anything in the brain has been hampered or changed, it changes the personality. Most of us are pretty clear if somebody if somebody falls down a flight of stairs and they break their arm, we can go, oh, well, there's a broken arm. We get it. Obvious. But a brain injury is often more about nuance. It's more, person hits their head, they may say, oh, I had a headache, I went to bed, and the next day I still kind of didn't feel right, but then I just kind of got used to it, or I got over it. But maybe they haven't. Right? So think about that. That was some of the knowledge I gained from this group, the brain injury, I'll call it BIG. So working with that individual woman, one of the things that was very useful, she had the idea of spoons, that everybody wakes up every day with a certain number of spoons of energy, and we want to help clients learn, okay, what is the amount every day? And it can be quite different. One day it could be 1 spoon, another day it could be 11.
Yep.
Right? To wake up every day, how many spoons do I have? How do I set priorities about using those spoons? Who can I bring into my life? We did a video recently on friendship. Do I have friends that I can pull in, or other professionals? Are there things I need to now change in my life in regards to the amount of energy or spoons that I have each day to spend? The other thing is, in this particular woman's story, part of what I learned was some of the people around her actually became resentful because she had been taking care of them for a very long time. All of a sudden, she was needing to be taken care of, plus she wasn't doing the care work for them. It made me think of much earlier in my life. I had a friend who I worked with also, and she had been working for years with women with cancer. That was her specialty area, women and cancer. And she told me that in many of her clients' stories, the woman had been in, let's say, an emotionally abusive context, but as she got sicker, the abuse became actually physical and became incredibly neglectful. And I remember at the time my whole body cringed to think, you've been in an emotionally abusive relationship, and now when you have cancer and you might be dying, the man who's supposed to love you the most actually starts slapping you around or being actively neglectful, like won't go and get your prescription for you or won't drive you to your doctor's appointment. And I remember thinking how shocking and horrible that was, but of course these things happen in the world, right? Of course. So in this one story, here's what I want you to notice, that when somebody has a diagnosis or something changes through a head injury or cancer, but because I'm talking about head injury, one of the first things you want to start asking them is, who in your life is available to support you? Obvious. Who can help care for you? But also, who in your life might start becoming resentful that you're not doing the things you used to do? In one of the stories that I heard through my experience with Big, similarly to the cancer stories, someone actually became abusive with the woman who had who was no longer able to fulfill her imagined perfect roles, right? So reflect on that. Ask who in your life might become impatient with you, who in your life might start being angry, where are there going to be dramatic roles, and help people prepare for it. But also, we may even have to help her find a whole different context to live her life. Let's say if that was her husband or her son or her father that she was living with, and this new configuration of spoons is going to change the family dynamics. We may have to help her find a new home, which might be the thing she most wants to not do, right? If you have suddenly a scare about your health, you're not usually motivated, oh, I think I want to move to a new apartment. But if she stays in a place where it's escalating abuse and neglect, that might not be in her best interests, right? So be on alert for that. I was startled by that. How could a woman has cancer and her husband is starting to be abusive and neglectful, or a woman has a stroke or a head injury, and all of a sudden the people in her life are being abusive and neglectful? It's the opposite of what you would intuitively think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's also important to consider, the perpetrators, I'm not saying that all of them are innocent, but it's, you also got to consider similarly whether that person, what role they're filling in their life. So whether that's the sole caregiver or whether they have a multitude of friends that are also helping, and that burden is shared rather than laid on one person. So that
Right.
person might be actively neglectful only because, say, for example, they also work 40, 50 hours a week.
Precisely. So our task as social workers doing family counseling, and it could be a head injury, it could be a stroke, could be cancer, it could be a heart attack, whatever the roles were that people were playing in that family, we can take this one example of a pattern with the organization of Big and the work that they do, and ponder, how are we going to help each member of that family reflect on their spoons, their opportunities, where in the past things were kind of on an edge, and this might throw it to a different place. So that's what I wish you to reflect upon. So now I want to make a few comments about art therapy. So we went in again as a team, as I've talked about with the groups we worked with men. So I worked with this individual woman, and she taught me lots of things. And then at one point, we were asked, well, hey, would you want to go in as a group and do art therapy with Big? And my memory is we went in 4 times, each time for about 3 hours, over, let's say, 3 or 4 weeks. And we did art with people, we did journaling with people. We invited them to do art pieces to talk about what it had been like to have this happen to them, the head injury. What was it like before? What was it like now? Or what has changed? So before the injury and subsequent to the injury. We also asked a question, and we always give opportunities for flexibility. What would you like people to know about people with head injuries? So we offered them these questions, and they made various art pieces. And my memory is there were about 12 people in the room. But this was one of the innovative things we did that I thought was quite lovely and a blessing as an experience as a practitioner. We went in with a team of about 6 or 7 people. So that meant that each artist, participant, had a facilitator with them. Because, of course, sometimes the fine motor skills have been disrupted for people who've had head injuries, or they may not have familiarity with working with paint or canvases or sparkles or glue or collage or journaling. So each participant had someone to help facilitate with them. Oh, I'll get you the blue paint, I'll get you the brush. Is this the kind of circle that you want on your image? Is this larger or smaller? Do you want to do it first with pencil, and then we'll do it with marker, and then we'll do it with paint, and incremental accomplishing of the expression? So that was very rich, and that was very lovely to have that level of facilitation with that ratio of clients. Thank you, Big, for doing that. That was one of the best moments of my life. The other part that was very wholesome as a strategy, if you're working at, this would be a meso level, like groups for mental health, you could take the structure I'm offering you could be applied to other contexts, but we did it in this case with Big, right? We brought lots of resources, we brought food, we made it a place to explore and feel safe and feel encouraged. At the end of each session, we invited people to go around and talk about what they were trying to express, or what they felt like from being there all day, or for the 3 hours or whatever, which for them is often all day, because people with these kind of injuries, sometimes they get very tired after an hour even, if they only have a little spoon that day. So we did this, but they got to share at the end of each session their story, their feelings, where they were at. I felt it was very beautiful in terms of creating solidarity, connection, break people out of the isolation and loneliness of their stories. It helped them realize problem-solving strategies, because a lot of them said, oh, I had this experience and I didn't feel understood. But now that I've heard you tell of the same story when you had this happen, I feel affirmed, but I also feel like that's pretty cool how you solved that problem. I'm going to try that if that ever happens to me again, right? Mm-hmm. The other thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of the family and the head injury story, we often think, oh, person had a head injury, then they got something solved, then they had a happy life. What I also learned from being in these workshops with these folks is that one loss quite frequently leads to another loss, another loss, another loss, another loss. So for example, if someone has had a stroke or a head injury, let's say they had a job, they had a lot of friends, they had a lot going on in their life, they have a stroke. Now they have the grief and loss of some of their intellectual capacity has been limited or changed, which may mean they can't work at their paid job anymore, they can only work at it part-time, which may mean they now have to confront poverty when they didn't have that as a challenge before, which may mean they aren't able to have excellent nutrition or an excellent housing situation or excellent transportation, which may mean they get more isolated and lonely, which may mean they turn to drink or drugs or overeating, which may mean, right? So I wish you to reflect on when these kind of things happen, it is often a whole cascading of losses and griefs, and that's much of what people were expressing in their art pieces. This happened, and then that happened, and then that happened, and then my husband left me. And then my husband and I started having a really difficult marriage. And then I couldn't tolerate the people who before had been renting a room in my house. Or some of those other things, within a year or two, they also change. So that creates more disruption for the primary struggling person here. So I wanted to do that. And I also wanted to say that they all, at least in the group that we were in, by the third, fourth session, they all were commenting on creativity was a really helpful forum for them. Working in groups like this was a very helpful forum for them. Expressing their story at the end of each session was very ennobling. They felt more prideful and strong about what they had been through and how they still were landing on their feet. And as they looked around the group and saw these other beautiful people who they too had been through a similar difficulty, but were still trying to land on their feet and still trying to be the best mom they could be, the best wife they could be, the best grandma they could be, the best citizen, the best neighbor, all those kinds of things. So they were able to applaud each other by focusing also on their strengths and accomplishments, because sometimes the healthcare professionals will only focus on the deficit or only focus on the medical dimension, right? So yes, it's sad that you've lost your job, but here's your prescription. So through having these creative networks like this, these 4 sessions or whatever, people really identified how much they benefited from this experience and how deep their longing was to have more experiences like this. And big, from my understanding, was planning to still offer quite a few of these in the future. And I would also want to comment on, many of these people came to these art events with their spouse or their caregiver. So the caregiver may have dropped them off and then gone off to do 3 hours of shopping or something like that that they needed for their own self-care. So that can be very good. And some of them stayed and did art with us and talked about what it was like for them as the primary caregiver of someone who had been through something like this. If we remember our ripples in one of our videos, we talked about every time one thing happens to a person, we want to note that it ripples out to the spouse, the kids, the neighbors, the co-workers. It inevitably has to in this kind of a sudden change to a person's potential and intellect. So I guess what I wanted to just say for this one is any change in the brain, whether that's from car accident, violence in the family, drugs, stroke, sports, we need to be very nuanced and discerning, because the person themselves may not fully realize what has happened, right? So as a caregiver, let's say, I'll make up a story, a couple comes in and the wife says, I don't know what's going on with him anymore. He's always yelling at me, he's always impatient. Last week, for the first time, we've been married 10 years, for the first time he started throwing things. We want to be on alert. Well, maybe something happened to him. Does he play hockey? Is he into extreme biking? What's that called?
Like BMX?
They take these bikes over tough terrains, and I've watched it on TV, and I thought, boy, their head is banging around inside there, and they can take tumbles from those bikes. I'll think of an hour after this video. I don't remember what that's called. Off-road biking. Dirt biking. There's a specific sport that a lot of young guys, I could imagine, are drawn to. Reflect on this. So this is one of those moments in social work. It's often referred to as the biopsychosocial. Looking at the entire physicality of people, looking at the brain, looking at any changes in the last few weeks or months before they've come to see you. Of course, we always ask, why now? Whatever the story is, you always ask, why now? Why is mom now coming in with her kid? Why now has the school started complaining about this kid's behavior in class? Why now has she filed for divorce? Why now versus yesterday or a month? So that's a given that you always ask that when someone comes to you for help. But also that cascading sequence of losses. I wanted to draw people's attention to that. Help your clients prepare for that. So you've had this head injury and that has changed you. You're now in a wheelchair, or you're now feeling very depressed, or you're feeling very angry. But also be prepared that within the next year or two, there's going to be a whole cascade of changes. Housing was a very common one that I learned through those workshops, is that because of the change in their physical ability, i.e. they couldn't, let's see now, go up 2 flights of stairs anymore, or they're in a wheelchair, so they need wheelchair accessibility, or they need to come and live closer to town because of healthcare appointments, when before they lived 50 miles out of town. So there's going to be a change in housing in the next while, probably. So explore that with them. Rather than they get to a point where they're 3 months behind with their rent and they're suddenly in a crisis situation. It might be a financial change, it might be because of those reasons that I just listed, but they probably will have to change their housing story. They may have to change all kinds of dimensions of their health, their food. If they're now taking different medications or they're in a wheelchair, they may need less calories, different calories. It seemed to me from the group that I was meeting that diabetes or other health conditions often started to appear within a year or 2 or 3 of the original head injury, and depression, a very common one. So wanting to alert you, the textbook is wonderful. There's almost nothing in the textbook that I disagree with, but some of the things I wanted to amplify, and this was one of them, around head injuries, and we could see it as an icon or an avatar of other sudden changes to a person's physical self. So the head injury, because it's less visible, is the one we want to be alert for. Versus, obviously if their leg gets cut off in a car accident or a factory accident, we're going to see that and know it, and they will see it and know it, and so will everyone around them. But head injuries or concussion can be very diffuse.
Yeah.
Big. Yeah. So reflect on all that, and then as one person in a story changes, so also will everyone around them probably have to go through small or large changes. And we as social workers, that's one of our superpowers, is to put people on alert for what may be down the road, and to anticipate those changes and help them prepare and muscle up for those changes, so the changes are engaged with in effective, appropriate ways rather than crisis management down the road, and in kind ways and loving ways. Help the family members to realize she only has 3 spoons of energy. For the previous 30 years, she made Christmas dinner, she made all the laundry, she did the housekeeping, she did everything, but now we're going to have to reassess who's going to do that stuff because she can't. That's the new normal we're working with, and we may have to be an advocate for some of those really practical things that people may not think of right away when there's been a head injury. Do you have another example?
A really good example is I have a friend, and his dad was in a car accident with his family. Surprisingly, he was the only one that sustained a head injury. However, they didn't know at the time that he had injured his head. I guess they had done tests on both his wife and his daughter, but because both of them had been, I guess they just he got lost in somewhere in between the cracks.
Okay. And or he was putting on that false bravado, that stoic thing that many men have been socialized to do.
Yeah, I'm fine. However, they, he had always been kind of a guy that could get worked up, but after that, he was the kind of guy that he would be sent into fits of rage. Yeah. He didn't have any patience, and it really affected his interactions with his family, to the point where I guess it was a joke to them almost, because he was so mad all of the time
Mm-hmm.
that when like other people would come into the house, it was uncomfortable for anyone else because he would seem mad, but that was just their normal.
Yeah.
And when he was really mad was when he would start throwing things.
Mm-hmm.
However, prior to this car accident, that wasn't something that he did.
Right. It's almost like they've been possessed by a demon when that wasn't who they were before. And we need to help all the family members understand that the person doesn't have a bad attitude. It's not that they're doing this on purpose. It's their brain has been changed. And one of the ways you can reflect on that is if all of a sudden I was in an accident and I could no longer see colors, let's say. I became colorblind, and people say, well, the blue one, get me the blue one, get me the blue cup from the kitchen. Well, I can no longer see colors. I just can't see colors. It's not that I'm choosing to be difficult. It's not that I'm trying to make your life hard. I am now colorblind and I can't see the color blue, so you can't ask me to do that. And when there's been a head injury, it's a struggle for people to get it, right? That if the mom, let's say, has always been so Martha Stewart, and she organizes Christmas and she organizes Thanksgiving and all these beautiful rituals on behalf of the family, and now she can barely brush her own teeth every day because she feels so depressed. It's not that she's chosen to abandon those roles. It's that her brain has changed. And we have to accept that and trust that she's telling you the truth. It's one of those injuries where, because we can't see it, it's hard to imagine it. You're looking at your mom's face. It's still your mom on the outside, or your wife, or your husband, or your son. But on the inside, something has changed. And it's also sometimes something that will never go back to what it was before. So pressuring them and saying, oh, you were in that car accident, that's already 4 months ago, get over it. You look the same, right? Well, they may never go back to being who they were before that. And that's tough to accept for the whole family. It especially in the cases where they were benefiting from something before. Oh, mom used to be a fabulous breadwinner. She always took care of all of these bills, or she always did the taxes for everybody, or she organized weddings, funerals, Christmas, and now she's not even returning my phone calls, right? So I learned a lot from hanging out with this organization and reading their pamphlets and hearing their stories and doing my research to prepare for the art workshops. And I'm very, very grateful. And I wanted to share what I learned so that you could pass on some of that when you're working with families. It's tough stuff. And I would emphasize that here in the North, where a lot of men work in tough industries like logging or fishing or roofing or those kind of blue-collar jobs, they are more prone to get these kinds of injuries. And then because we're in the North, they might be less likely to either reach out for help because of that traditional masculinity profile, and or it might be tougher for them to get a good diagnosis, an accurate diagnosis, and then to get the help they need to maybe regain or rebuild some skills that would help them manage it. Because again, here in the North, depending where you live, you may not have access to the appropriate or the best case specialists to help you with these things. That was another thing that the group taught me in these art sessions, is that many of them had a very tough time finding really good diagnostic information. They might know, okay, I come to realize it was that concussion, I'm different now than I was before. Good luck with that, right? Versus really, really longitudinal, solid, substantive, meaningful help to build new skills and to be aware of how their brain had changed. So there's some of my summary. That is very relevant to families. This could be a very common thing that could end up in your office if you were doing family counseling. And it could also show up long after this happened. So a kid is having a hard time in school, and the kid is 12, and you come to learn more about the kid and then about the family, and then you realize, oh, 3 years ago, up until 3 years ago, it was a pretty happy, functioning, and okay family. Dad got a head injury or mom got a head injury, And since then, now the couple is arguing, they have less money, they've had to move 3 times. Mom or dad used to drive them to hockey, they had to drop out of hockey. So the kid is acting out, and at first you could be, well, this kid is being bad. But actually there's other stories unfolded behind the scenes. So helping the kid understand how that whole thing has happened, and maybe rather than only working with the kid, maybe if you could help mom and dad to get the support they need from an organization like BIG, that might help the kid to feel happier, calmer, right?
Yeah, because
It's indirect.
That brain injury will affect how you interact with the world and thus affect your relationships. So being the kid of that, I can only imagine.
Yeah, mom used to love me, but now she doesn't do any cooking at home. She never does my laundry, and she just stays in bed all day. Well, mom still loves you exactly the same way she used to, but she doesn't have spoons of energy to do all these things for you. So let's figure out who else could help you with these things. You deserve that level of mothering and love and care, but mom can't do it right now. What can we do instead? How can we enrich your life so that you have what mom used to give you? And also know mom still loves you. She just physically, she can't see the color blue anymore since her injury, right? So thank you for joining us today for this video on head injuries, the organization Big Downtown, using a little bit of art therapy, and also reminding us that when one member of the family changes, so also will the other members of the family have to make some accommodations, or they may resist some accommodations. So how do we help them to do all that? Yeah. Thank you, Tuva. Thank you, Carlene.
No problem.